Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode titled Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sarah, what movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about Reagan. Rena, can you give us a trigger warning?
I sure can, Sarah. This movie contains depictions of imaginary nuclear war, rubbery, uncanny valley face makeup, homophobic stereotyping, one-dimensional acting, mild physical violence, dementia, and death of a pet. Sarah, can you think of anything I may have left out?
No. I mean, there's so much, but no.
Okay.
And Rena, can you give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning. We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points of works of narrative art that are not Reagan.
Consider yourselves warned. Just to talk a little bit about sources I used in this episode, I used the entire internet over the last day or two to try and center myself in the reality of what actually happened during the Reagan administration and the years prior. Rena, do you have any sources you want to mention?
Like you, I was a little bitty thing during the Reagan administration, but I grew up reading Bloom County and Doonesbury omnibus editions that were sitting around the house. That was how I knew who everyone in the administration was, and then subsequently looking up these things that I remembered from then. It served me well because my AP American History class never got past Vietnam, so I was able to answer all of the questions about the 80s and early 90s on the AP American because of Bloom County and Doonesbury. And I once almost landed a job because I knew who Jean Kirkpatrick was from reading Bloom County. She was Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the UN, and there was a subplot in Bloom County where she dated Bill the Cat. Sarah, we need to talk about why episode 20 is coming out before episode 19.
Part of this is about the love that we feel for our audience, and that we want to make sure that curiosity does not get the better of you and convince you to go see this movie and to stare at it in horrified awe, like the train wreck that it is. I cannot express enough, you should not see this movie. So we wanted to get this out in front of people in order to hopefully get them to have their curiosity about what this film consists of sated in order to avoid spending any money on it, as we did, which I'm not proud of. And also just figure I want to just define a word that you may or may not be familiar with, but I've been using it a lot this week and probably will use it a lot in this episode. And that word is hagiography, which is defined as writing of the lives of saints. It also means adulatory writing about another person or biography that idealizes its subject. To call this movie a hagiography is almost not sufficient. It transcends that in a way that is offensive.
Episode 19, which we will drop next week, was about and starring Pancho Villa as himself. We recorded that last week. And we say on it, this is episode 19. So this episode on Reagan is episode 20, but we realized we need to crash this in while this movie is still in theaters.
I'm not exactly sure where to begin here, but I do want to acknowledge that, I am a stereotypical liberal coastal elite. I don't care for Ronald Reagan at all, to put it mildly. But all that said, that isn't the only reason why this movie isn't good. I wouldn't want to see any version of this movie made about any of the people that I love and admire in this world, be it my Lord and Savior Martin Scorsese or Jane Fonda or Joan of Arc or anyone. This is not a good movie because it is art that refuses to interrogate itself.
And I am grateful that Reagan ended the Cold War, but I don't think he was the one as they posit he is in this film. I think it was possible for there to be someone who could end the Cold War while having a more economically merciful society. Reagan said ketchup was a vegetable to cut nutrition for poor children. Reagan ignored the AIDS crisis because the wrong people had AIDS. We were wondering who would play Rock Hudson in this, and shocker, spoiler, nobody is cast as Rock Hudson. But it's also that this film, I felt that I gained more sympathy for George W. Bush watching W than I gained for Ronald Reagan watching Reagan, because in trying to sanctify their subject, they make them one-dimensional. A film made by liberals that made Reagan the villain would probably give you a more fully human Reagan than a film trying to say, look how awesome Ronald Reagan is, because there's no room for subtlety in it. It's either all good or all bad, and this script sounds like a third grade pageant thing. Every line of dialogue is unnatural and super didactic. Something you also observed in Gotti, where scenes have 5 or 6 lines of interchange and then cut. And it's all driven to want to make you think a certain way.
This movie bends over backwards and sideways in every which way to not say anything critical about Reagan. I think that the meanest it gets is basically saying that he loves America too much. You can either go in two directions here. Reagan is either an optimistic idiot or he is a monstrously bad human being. Those are kind of the two poles we're presented with, and we are given Reagan like the optimist put here by God. There's a real Forrest Gump energy. There's a real like simple Jack from Tropic Thunder energy to the way he is portrayed in this movie.
As we were rolling into the movie through the opening credits, you were whispering the number of production companies. How many did you clock?
I only clocked 4.
Huh.
I know. The logos were going by very quickly. Like, they didn't drag it out as much as they do sometimes with these movies that have like a patchwork of weird shadowy funding.
I found myself thinking The Conqueror was more bearable than this, but I remember we were free to pause The Conqueror. We watched it in increments over a 2-week period.
Yeah, having all of this like punch me in the face for 2.5 hours was pretty brutal.
This movie has 3 framing devices at least, and a good movie does not need more than 1-2 framing devices tops. They might have a weakness on telling you why you should care, so they need multiple layers of here is why you should care. So we begin with a pointless baseball anecdote. The camera zooms in, and then John Hinckley Jr. shoots him.
My first note as we opened was, oh God, what a folksy asshole. His voice, not here to tell you whether or not Dennis Quaid is a good actor or not. I will say that he's terrible in this, but the material doesn't give anyone a lot of opportunity to investigate their characters too much in terms of like what kind of person they were. I also think like there's a fundamental flaw. Like, some people you just shouldn't make movies about because they've achieved a level of parody that it's very challenging to play them without it becoming kind of like the meta level of you playing them and it seeming like a Saturday Night Live sketch. I think Reagan has achieved this. So he's got the voice and he's got on so much makeup. There's like a real uncanny valley kind of thing happening where he looks kind of computer generated and kind of animatronic. And it's such a surface level imitation because, again, like there's nothing to investigate to make him anything less than Superman put here by God in this movie. As he's getting shot, he's doing a voiceover, and he said, you know, my mother told me everything in life happens for a reason. And I'm like, oh, really? Wow, that's deep. No one's mother has ever said that before. We open on this Hinckley shooting, and then we roll into the credits. This anti-communist grind that really tells us how evil the Soviet Union is.
I agree with everything they're showing here about why communism is bad, but it's the way that they're bonking you on the head with, these are the things we have cherry-picked from the past 90 years of history to really bonk you on the head. This movie is so heavy-handed. Then we go to our third framing device, and we meet Jon Voight as Viktor Petrovich, a retired KGB agent who is not a real person. See, this actually falls under a rule that we set in Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing, where I said that something does not count as a biopic if it introduces a fictional character as a way of taking us in. So Viktor Petrovich is someone like who is not real, who was assigned to try to make a useful idiot of Reagan at the time of HUAC, and he's telling this story to a young Russian who wants to know why the Soviet Union failed. Jon Voight, not only, they tried to make him look like 40 years younger, but he's under so many layers of makeup and like a wig, and it looks like, to top that off, when they have the face of the poorly youthed Jon Voight on screen, it looks like they've also smeared Vaseline on the camera. I will give Jon Voight credit, at least in the scenes where he isn't burdened with the makeup. He's a good actor. His accent work, as you were saying, he is not an accent man. He is here to marvel at Reagan and to do a lot of telling, not showing.
I mentioned this on our Reagan preview episode. Viktor Petrovich is the name of a real person who was the manager of the Chernobyl plant the night that it went offline. I was like thinking of ways to make this framing device more interesting. And I was like, Viktor Petrovich, the manager of the Chernobyl plant, talking to a young Vladimir Putin. Better movie. More interesting framing device. This whole thing is set up as he's explaining that Reagan was so dazzling and awesome and amazing and sent here by God, and he was the Crusader, and that is why the Soviet Union collapsed. It had nothing to do with them over-indexing on invading Afghanistan or the aforementioned greatest nuclear disaster that ever happened on this planet in Chernobyl, and decades of kleptocracy. It was none of those things. It was because Ronald Reagan, the actor, showed up. We go back in time, and this takes on the written and dramatic energy of a school play combined with a video game, and meet one Leonid Brezhnev, who's played by one Robert Davi. Like, these are all actors too in this movie who have been quote unquote canceled for being monstrous and being bad people, who are all over this movie. And he sets up something that never delivers, which is Jon Voight's they say that it's my fault that the Soviet Union fell. That never gets paid off. We never get that explained to us. Which is a bummer. And he's trying to explain, we had plans, we had to infiltrate the US and, as you said, make a useful idiot out of Ronald Reagan. And this is all introduced to us. We first meet Reagan in 1945 when they're talking about how the USSR had plans to infiltrate the film industry and merge the labor unions. This is some wild shit. And that is why, and basically create a justification through this theory that the film presents, that this is why HUAC needed to exist. And this is why Joe McCarthy and Roy Khan are actually heroes. Oh, good. We're going to talk about that asshole again tonight. And we also at this point meet Jane Wyman, who is Reagan's wife, who's played by Mina Savari. And she looks awful in this movie. She's a beautiful woman and she looks horrible. I will just add here, everyone in this movie looks horrible.
There's yet another pedantic quote here. History is never about when, where, why. It is about who. So this movie apparently ascribes to the critically debunked great man theory.
Yeah, it does.
And then, horribly upsetting, this guy from some 90s band is playing Frank Sinatra. He has an enormous chin. He does not look like Frank Sinatra. He does not sound like Frank Sinatra. I am disturbed.
May I clarify?
Yes.
It is Scott Stapp, the lead singer of Creed. And yes, he is playing Frank Sinatra. He also looks like he's never been in a tuxedo before. He looks so physically uncomfortable in this scene. And thank God it's mercifully short.
Nina Savari looks like 10 years older than she is in this. And I don't know why they needed to do that, because she's gorgeous. They do a hatchet job on Dalton Trumbo.
How dare you, movie?
He comes across in this as like every mincing effete stereotype of how gay men were portrayed, but it isn't just that we've seen Trumbo. You looked up videos of Dalton Trumbo, and this is not how he looked or talked. And furthermore, we see this in Trumbo. He was married to a woman who he enjoyed having sex with.
You know how I feel about Bryan Cranston. I was, again, meditating on this morning because I wanted to just confirm that, like, that there was at no point that Dalton Trumbo seemed like a mincing homosexual, which I want to be clear, there is nothing wrong with that. And I'm wondering if, like, the direction was just play like that gay guy that Philip Seymour Hoffman played that one time. Play it like you think a writer is. And I'm like, did they confuse Truman Capote with Dalton Trumbo? That's how not Dalton Trumbo this performance is. And Dalton Trumbo, as I predicted, is set up as a villain for talking about people deserving to have health care. Reagan isn't initially interested in this. He's like, I just want to go dance with my beautiful bride. I can't even do an imitation of the voice. It's horrible, but it's very on. We cut to Victor explaining that Ronald Reagan has always hated communism because in 1922, we find out that he, started going to church. His dad is school play Irish drunk. We have one of those alcoholic fights that you hear in everything where she's going, well, you lost your job again. It's awful. His mother tells him that he's destined for something special. And then enter the movie Reverend Kevin Sorbo. Kevin Sorbo is a terrible person also, and a canceled person. And he most recently, notably, was on the internet saying that if our vice president, Kamala Harris, would like to prove that she is Black, she should say the N-word. So you know what? I don't feel bad at all making fun of him and how much he sucks and how out of place and weird he is in this movie and how he's a terrible human being. And that's why you're in this movie for 2 scenes, is because you're a garbage person who no one wants to be around and no one wants to work with. Take some responsibility for yourself. Sorry.
So they talk about how Reagan's great inspiration is this Horatio Alger knockoff book about a kid who gets success by finding God. And I was physically uncomfortable the whole time. I had a prediction that was not quite borne out, which was that this future president of Russia, who is talking to Viktor the fake Petrovich in this framing device, will be converted to loving capitalism by the end, which doesn't quite happen, but he does leave with a Russian translation of this inspiring Horatio Alger knockoff book.
I think my favorite part of this was just the idea that the Russians would go through the trouble to translate this book, which Victor says, they call it dime store novel. Yeah, I'm sure the Russians went to the trouble to translate this forgettable book. It wasn't even by Horatio Alger. And then we go back to seeing Reagan, the lifeguard, and the ladies love him. And Victor's like, I had to go back further to when he was a lifeguard. And performing his duty wouldn't always result in praise because, like, sometimes he'd rescue people and they didn't want to be rescued or whatever. And also how he was really into bringing people together. They show one example where he brings some Black students to his house to stay because they couldn't stay in the hotel for a travel football game, which I was like, that totally makes up for the mythological welfare queen that he invented in order to justify undermining social services nets for people, right?
We see these two grateful black guys from the football team. Later on, there's someone in a situation room who has possibly one line who I think is supposed to be Colin Powell, but I'm not sure. And then there's a few there as scenery. I wrote down the note, Quaid is so bad in this scene. Why is he so bad? And it's this pep talk with from Jack Warner telling him why, as the new president of SAG, he needs to stop everything merging, and the sound of his voice makes me shudder. We see how Jane is the first wife who doesn't get him.
Oh my god, she does not get him. I have a note here. Did Leni Riefenstahl make this movie? Did she rise from the dead and make this movie?
That is a discredit to Leni Riefenstahl.
It really is, because there's like maybe 2 or 3 moments where I was like, this is actually thoughtful filmmaking. Some interesting shot setups, like credit where it's due in a few moments. We see him making a speech and he and Jane Wyman get in a fight. And it's supposed to be like this huge speech to the Screen Actors Guild. And there's like 10 extras in this scene. We find out as he's testifying maybe before HUAC, who the hell knows. Victor voiceovers, Reagan was an FBI informant, and makes it seem like the way that he was informing on people who may have had communist sympathies was a heroic move. And then we cut to Sterling Hayden, who is a noted rat and tattletale from HUAC, praising him and being like, he was a one-man fighting machine against everything bad. And we're seeing like how Reagan stopped communism from entering the entertainment industry, but at the cost of his marriage.
Go Jane. Congrats on getting out of that trap. There's a punch-out scene with Herb Sorrell's forces, yay, men punching stuff. And the line, we own this town, and SAG votes to stay independent. And my note was, what is the real story on this? And then they say, this is genuinely sad that one of Reagan's children with Jane Wyman only lived for a day. But when they're at the tombstone, I noted for some reason every tombstone in this movie looks like CGI, and the production values are decent, but the tombstones look computer generated. I don't know how, I don't understand.
It's true, they do. And all of the tombstones look the same. I did notice that. Like when he goes to visit his mom's tombstone, spoiler alert, his mom dies. Also, it's implied that because Jane Wyman is more successful, it destroys their marriage. Like she had to go be more successful. And then it's 1949, and who should show up on the scene but Nancy Davis, the blowjob queen? She was very popular on the MGM lot, according to Kitty Kelly's book, for giving very good blowjobs. There's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that she would go on to moralize and do harm to other people who were sexually active.
Ron and Nancy fall in love when one of them says, family is important. And here I wrote, I want to make myself small and merge with my leather chair so that I become a senseless, inanimate object and lose consciousness of this film.
Their meet cute is all about how she has been accidentally put on a list of people who are communist. And she's all, you're the president of the Screen Actors Guild. Therefore, you need to get me off this list. This is another Nancy Davis.
Penelope Ann Miller is terrible in this. She has tears in her eyes, or she's shrieking, and she's defining every behavioral attribute that conservatives define as shrill when liberal women do it. Has she been good in other stuff? Did she used to be hot? What's going on here?
Oh God, Penelope Ann Miller makes me so sad. She bums me out because she's outstanding in a movie from the 80s called Adventures in Babysitting. She gives a great little performance in that movie. She worked consistently through the 80s. She probably reached her highest level of power and acclaim when she was the girl in Carlito's Way. She also had an affair with Al Pacino on the set of that movie that she talked about really publicly in a way that probably you shouldn't do. And then she never after that. This script does her no favors. She is hysterical most of the time when she's not just being like, I brought you some jelly beans, Ron.
Later on, we get a scene of one of those legendary evenings of the Reagans watching TV together in matching sweaters. at the White House.
What the hell is that?
Don't know.
They're so weird and codependent.
She goes horseback riding with him after saying, I have a confession to make. I don't ride horses. And then Reagan's career is downhill, downhill, downhill. He's in Las Vegas, which then was where you went when your career was dead. Now it's a way for Rihanna to make some more money. And he calls his agent and says, if I go out there, my career is dead. But he goes out there to hawk PBR, the ironic hipster beer of 2004. And then he's mad. He angrily breaks a beer bottle and smokes cigarettes. Is this supposed to make him look cool?
After he throws the beer bottle, we have a line where Jon Voight pops back into this movie and reminds you that he's in it. And he's like, meanwhile, his career continues to fade. And then his mom dies. And then it's 1962. And he's doing TV commercials. And we see like Cuba is happening and the Berlin Wall is getting built. And how part of his responsibility as a pitch person is that he meets with the factory workers who he'll later fuck over, and starts to win them over. And then he presents Nancy with the theory that he will use to destroy the Russians, which is all they have are missiles and oil. We just have to get them to spend all of their money, which is what they do. And then he explains that because he was a lifeguard, he is qualified to iterate on foreign policy and run the government because he learned how to read currents in a river, which is an interesting theory. I too was a lifeguard when I was a teenager, and I can't tell you the things that it qualifies me for now, like running a government, because I know how to look out for people who are going to drown.
This lifeguard quote was one of the things we gagged over in the trailer, and I cringed at it again, and we see the young Ronnie making notches on a board for the number of lives that he's saved. And he says this line to these Republicans that he's meeting with to switch parties: I didn't leave them, they left me. At this point, again, I gagged audibly and gave the screen the finger.
Yeah, me too.
I have a favorite story about Ronald Reagan where he was over in Britain shortly after World War II, and he was upset because he couldn't get a steak. He took this as evidence of, look what socialism is doing to the British. And it's like, no, the British took the full brunt of fighting World War II for us. They were the ones who got bombed every week. They were still on rationing. A whole generation was malnutritioned, and they suffered. What we dealt with rationing over here was a fraction. And you're judging them because as they're barely getting on their feet again, you can't get a steak.
I mean, the best part of rationing, too, is that Americans made a lot of sacrifices comparatively to what we've ever been asked to do now in World War II. You know, no one got a new car for 5 years in the United States is just one of the things we ration on. Imagine asking anyone in a red state to not get a car for 5 years after they couldn't handle wearing a mask in public or not going to Applebee's for 2 months.
It's notable at the point where he says the party left me. After having been a New Deal Democrat, the party left me. The point where he left the party was around when the Democrats got involved with making sure that people of color and women got a fair shake.
So, New Deal programs ushered in the prosperity that he would go on to destroy because he and his party hate sharing.
This movie could not be made about FDR because a movie about FDR, it's that line that I think I first heard it about 25 years ago, that liberals see the world in shades of gray and conservatives see the world in black and white. But a movie about FDR would show that his judgment on the greater good was that the New Deal was not engineered for everybody, or it would show him not bombing the crematorium at Auschwitz. And it would show the times that he made judgments that we question now in the name of a greater good. And it would have room for subtlety.
These movies, part of the reason it's trash is the fact that it refuses to acknowledge that he had any faults of any kind. Every scene is him walking into a room and it ending with a mic drop. It's fan service for zealots. At this point, he is asked, what's the most important issue facing this country? And he's like, beating communism. Freedom is more important than anything. Just like the idea that if we don't fight communism, nothing else matters. There's no other domestic issue that is of any concern besides beating the Russians. All these Republicans are like, yeah, you should run for office. And he's like, I'm going to run for governor. I don't even know why I keep trying to talk like him. I do not have the gift. And so he starts campaigning for Goldwater. And every time he starts speaking politically, they show all of the people everywhere stopping what they're doing and like listening to his oratory and just being like, oh my God, listen to him. Then they'll always also cut to the Russians who are like shitting their pants over this chosen one taking on power. Everyone gets shook every time. And then the real star of the movie arrives. They're going out and knocking on doors, and this woman answers the door, and you're like, we're running for governor. And she's like, oh, who are you? He's like, he says something about being an actor, and Nancy's all, his initials are right here. They're RR. She says, oh, honey, Roy Rogers is here, and he's running for governor. And this was the best scene in the movie. Hands down.
I had a fantasy of this. When we watched the trailer, I had a whole backstory for this about how this woman is out and out trolling them because she has loved ones who were exiled by HUAC. But that's just my headcanon.
And it's a fine headcanon. And he wins as governor of California. They don't show the part where he empties the asylums and starts the homeless crisis in California, because God forbid we pay for social services. And then we also see a sequence where he's dealing with the fact that students are protesting, and they make sure to insert, they don't even know what they're protesting for. Yeah, it's just the late 60s. I don't know, was there a war on or something?
They also have a needle drop to wild thing, which drove us insane. The protesters are just such cliches with like, make love, not war.
Yeah, they don't even know what they're protesting for. I was like, oh my God, there's always gadflies in any social protest movement, but there was a war that felt real bad to a lot of people happening where we were trying to fight communism or something again and trying to stop the domino effect, and people were really upset about it. I'm sure that they were just doing it for the fun of it. He brings in the National Guard to the students who are all in order to like attack and undermine any sort of protest movement. And he says that the schools are letting the students make all the demands. And then a young man named Dana pops in on his lawn to start the Youth for Reagan organization. Dana will come up again later in the movie, but Reagan spends a bunch of time chatting with him and gives him some coffee. And then they meet with some fundamentalists, including Pat Boone. And Jon Voight talks about this, and he's like, this thing happens that's just so insane, where the religious fundamentalists prophesize that he will be president as long as he stays on the side of righteousness. There's more slideshows of things as he's being governor, and they're saying like sometimes he was unpopular, but he was principled. There's more horses. At one point, he's talking to one of his advisors, and he's like, well, the Soviets are here to stay. And I'm like, yeah, there's a whole freaking continent of them. What are you plotting? And he says, president can do a thing or two. So he's going to run for president now because that's the prophecy.
In a moment of giving credit here, the footage of the ranch is gorgeous.
I will absolutely say that they sent those drones up, and those drones did a heck of a job getting footage of that ranch.
Someone says, you just may need to save us. And we are at the 1976 convention. And what I wrote down here on the little light-up pen that you so nicely bought me was, they used to smoke at conventions, and it seems like a good idea. I want a cigarette. I want to die faster if it reduces the amount of time that I have to live with this movie in my brain. Another thing that I did like, there are a lot of great three-piece suits in this movie. I love a three-piece suit. I want to start an organization called CADS, or Citizens Against the Deformalization of Society, where like we agitate to have dress up days in office where you wear evening gowns and tuxes.
I'm not against that. And this is what conventions used to be. It's kind of interesting to see that, like where there's drama behind who's going to be the nominee. He loses and Victor voices over, there's no defeat more bitter than political defeat, which I would disagree with that on its face.
I can think of lots of forms of defeat that are more bitter.
And then he says, well, Ford stole it through patronage and through promising people rides on Air Force One, which put a pin in that shit, because we're coming back to that. Reagan's all just like, I just want to stop the Soviets. My God. Really? That's all you care about? Carter wins and the communists are all excited because, as you know, Carter, that monster, the villain, is going to be the way-in for the communists. And, you know, stagflation is going on. A whole bunch of annoying economic stuff falls in Carter's lap that's way more complicated than I care to get in this podcast.
And at this point, I took a bathroom break and you said, you are coming back.
You were having a tough time during this movie.
I really was.
Yeah.
I missed the election of 1980 because I just knew that I was going to find the debate scene unbearable. And he gets shot.
Everyone's very moved by his comments at the debate. They don't get into how Reagan ripped the solar panels off the roof of the White House because, God forbid, we ever rely on any sort of other source of energy. That they can't show him doing that, or going back to things that we put a pin in, the stealing through patronage, the fact that Reagan and his cronies worked out a thing where they didn't release the hostages in the Iran hostage crisis until he won the election, just to stick it to Jimmy Carter. They make such a point bending over throughout this movie to be like, well, Reagan was the good guy and everyone else was the bully. And Reagan was the bully. They make it seem like the Iranians just released them because Reagan got elected and they were like, well, here's a winner now. The Russians are shitting their pants again. They're all, oh no, not this Reagan. It's like a Superman cut. Like, it's like, there's like a sort of noxious superhero quality to the way Reagan is presented in this movie. Like, when he gets shot, all the doctors look like freaked out. And I was kind of thinking, like, are they going to show Nancy come in and do the surgery herself because no one is better than these two people?
Oh, they practically do. And they show her making a big fuss and insisting on going to the hospital when there are lockdown protocols in place. You follow your lockdown protocols. It's one of the sacrifices that you make in being a high up politician. And he wakes up and he tells the doctors, I hope you're all Republicans. I rolled my eyes. Oh gosh, I felt so bad for poor Dan Lauria. He shows up as Tip O'Neill. He's like mildly charming, but the script, again, does no favors. And they recite the walk through the valley of the shadow of death prayer. I feel so bad for Wonder Year's dad here.
He looks so much like Tip O'Neill. I thought he gave, for what he had to work with, gave a good performance. And it also made me really sad for a moment. Like, as I think it's clear, I don't like Ronald Reagan, but there was a time period before everything became zero-sum game for one side of this country and for one party. There used to be a time period where there was this all in it together thing that was decimated by Reagan. Let me be clear, where like there was a prevalence of decency at the end of the day, where people ultimately wanted to make this country a better place, even if their ideologies didn't merge. And that's over. Nancy brings him his jelly beans, though. I can't with these jelly beans in this movie. I get it. Like, I know he liked jelly beans, but like, stop with the damn jelly beans.
Oh, yeah. There's some scene where we meet George Schultz where there's a whole theory of people around jelly beans that you can tell everything about them by whether they go for a specific color or grab a handful. There's also a scene where someone is talking about revenue increase and we get a big speech about why supply side economics is good. But my note was, wow, even Republicans used to responsibly raise taxes to avoid a deficit. And then, hooray, we are making more nukes.
In this part, they just insert in there that they had to fire those air traffic controllers. They had to do it. There's all this talk about the nukes. And then someone shoots the Pope, and apparently it was the KGB behind it. And then all of a sudden, the Pope and the Crusader are on the same side and have like this seminal link because they've both been shot at.
To add, if you are a Jew or a Muslim, Crusader does not mean good things. It means a bunch of assholes who showed up and started killing everybody because they thought they should own Jesus land. About 1,000 years ago.
Not an inaccurate word to describe him in a sense. And Reagan then expresses his entire policy of the way that everything works for him, which is we win, they lose. And then he calls in Dana and says, I'm about to start the biggest war without firing a shot. And they start talking about speeches and making sure that everything he says counts. And he quotes C.S. Lewis, and I was all, how dare you quote C.S. Lewis?
I don't believe Reagan ever read the Screwtape Letters. Dana probably read them. Dana seems like a total hippie, so I don't get why he kind of falls in with this, oh, Reagan is awesome thing now.
Dana is Dana Rohrabacher. Dana Rohrabacher was a Republican who was a press secretary and then later speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. Dana Rohrabacher, who was a Russian plant, maybe. He was certainly compromised, likely beginning in the early 90s. He became a congressman, and then it's very likely that from there he was visited by some Russian agents and became a very good friend of Vladimir Putin. And even Kevin McCarthy, feckless man that he is, alleged that there were two people he thought were on Vladimir Putin's payroll, and one of them was Dana Rohrabacher, and the other one was Donald Trump. So glad to have you in the movie, Dana. And I'm not proud of this, but I did find myself sort of excited for the speech writers during this movie because they were super excited and super into what they were doing. We see the Soviets freaking out yet again. Then we start talking about the missile shield, Star Wars, that he built. And how he got that idea for a movie from a movie that he made. Then we have a Korean Airlines flight that the Russians shot down that everyone gets upset about. And they think that it's going to become World War III and that we're going to go into nuclear agitation. There's a sequence where we almost do, but it was a bunch of birds that set off a satellite system. We almost went to nuclear war over that. And we have this like Pong-esque computer screen of the United States where they're showing where the civilian casualties are going to be when all of the nukes go off. And then he has this fantasy sequence where he sees New York City getting bombed because that's what everybody loves to do in conservative media.
We have the New York with the Twin Towers, and it's this vision that he has where you go into his pupil and you see this playing out. And I felt like, okay, that's where the budget went. Into destroying New York.
That's where the budget always goes.
Yeah.
We see 2 minutes where they explain that some people didn't like Reagan, and they do nothing. This was infuriating because it is the one nod that they have to the whole AIDS crisis and the fact that he destroyed the middle class. And that he destroyed unions and that he made it, really unsafe to be anything but wealthy and Christian and white in America. And they nod to it while they're playing the song Land of Confusion by Genesis, and showing clips from that music video. And also the Just Say No campaign, they show that. And inflation.
They're showing all these people unironically to say, look how wrong they are, but just say no did not work. The war on drugs did not work. There's shots of kids getting down in like early MTV gear, and I'm like, so okay, reminder, here are all the people from the 80s who were awesome. Okay.
This was such a weird choice. And it was a weird choice because, like, yes, they showed that there was some criticism of Reagan. They didn't show how he dealt with it. They didn't show how he responded to it or even that he cared about it. And I think this movie was kind of making the point that none of these people matter because they show it in a bubble and don't address it at any point beyond that. They just say some people didn't like him. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? Those people who dealt with the AIDS crisis and with an uncaring, unfeeling government that did nothing about it. Yeah, I bet they didn't like him. You know what? I don't like him for that either. It was so offensive to put it in those terms and then drop it and walk away from it and be like, see, we covered it. They didn't cover it. I'm not suggesting that there should be complexity to it, because the government fell on its face when it came to the AIDS crisis, period. We don't even see conflict around that. We don't see him wrestling with the idea of it and his choice to never acknowledge it.
We cut to the debate prep where Ronnie is terrible with numbers. Nancy goes all shrill.
Oh my God.
Again.
Let Ronnie be Ronnie.
She's like, instead of cramming his head with useless numbers, why don't you let Ronnie be Ronnie? And she talks through this.
And he somehow turns the tide on that. And he wins. And hooray, everybody's so happy, except the Russians. And then this was a sequence that I legit laughed at when he's talking about, like, when Brezhnev dies. And they keep setting up this scene where they show Jon Voight going to talk to the latest Secretary General of the Soviet Union. And you see them like smoking, and then they die, and they cut to the same footage of state funeral showing that there were 3 of them that died very quickly, one after the other. And I laughed at this. This was set up well. And then Reagan saying, how can I talk to them if they keep dying on me?
This was the one genuinely funny part of the movie where they show that the Soviet leaders are all in terrible health. Like the third one has this ashtray the size of a hubcap. And that was genuinely funny. And all 8 or 12 of us in the theater, everyone actually laughed at that.
Yeah. Then we meet Margaret Thatcher, Leslie Ann Down, and oh my God, this wig. All of the wigs in this movie are nightmarish.
Leslie Ann Down is the worst Thatcher I've ever seen. She does not get the voice. She does not get the mannerisms. She's just there in a wig with a received pronunciation accent.
She's not even trying. We have our first summit in Reykjavik where Reagan is meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev. And it's all, once again, like look at Reagan, how he dunks on everyone. Jon Voight is looking stressed out by all of this. And everyone just loves Ronald Reagan, and including Gorbachev. And we see how Reagan seduces and destroys Gorbachev, according to this movie. Everyone's getting along because Reagan's perfect. That's my note. Oh, and then the goldfish happens.
My note on the goldfish was, goldfish dies. How sentimental. He killed the goldfish through neglect, just like he killed all the people who died of AIDS when his administration took years to acknowledge it because the wrong people had it. And here comes Iran-Contra.
It's a hot mess. The plan was hatched to sell arms to somebody and something and the Sandinistas and what have you. A lot of money went missing, and it was something that Reagan was explicitly not supposed to do that he did. Nancy has a tantrum about how Reagan is just too good of a person. So Nancy's like, you have to fight, Ronnie! While holding a jar of jelly beans, I think. And there's like a lot of language about like some laws got broken. They fail to explain Iran-Contra, which is very, as I said, convoluted and complicated. And there's a line in here. He was still the lifeguard trying to get his people home safe. And again, furious. Like, how dare you, movie? How dare you? And then we are going back to the negotiating table with the Russians, and Dana Rohrabacher is writing a speech for Reagan to give in West Berlin. Everyone is like, is he going to say it? Is he going to say it? He gets up there on that stage and he says, tear down this wall. And everyone cheers and applauds, and we see people listening to the speech everywhere. And there's the line, again, pointing out Reagan's entire way of being. What are we here for but to win?
Here's the thing. I am a fan of Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. And in a subtler movie about how communism fell apart, I might have cheered. I am a fan of the Iron Curtain falling. We had this like golden moment where the Cold War was over and we'd won.
Also, at this point, I realized like I had spent the entire movie trying to figure out what exactly Jon Voight's young person beard looked like. And it looks like, do you remember those boards with the metal filings in them that you could move around to make like facial hair? Yeah, it looks like that. It looks like flocking.
Yeah, and also whatever it looks like they used that like comb on hair color stuff on him. Also, Victor the retired spy, why does he have all his old KGB files in his private home?
Maybe in the post-Gorbachev Yeltsin era, you could kind of just take your stuff and go. Like, things were very chaotic. Like, I think you could just get away with a lot of crazy shit. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was just like, I'm just going to take my files. Nobody's going to notice.
Why? Do your files have... I guess the files must have sentimental value around his hero worship of Reagan.
I get the sense that Victor, like, hate jerks off to Reagan every night. He's clearly like deeply enamored with him, like calling him the Crusader and all that. There's a love and a reverence for Reagan in that man. And if not that, then at least Jon Voight goes home and spends a lot of time staring at the files about Reagan. Maybe those are from Jon Voight's own personal files, because he loves those Republicans.
Jon Voight begged to be in this movie.
Oh, for sure. He did this for free.
Really?
No, I'm just guessing. I don't know for sure. Like, I think everyone probably did work for scale because they love Reagan so much. They make it out like Reagan personally took that wall down. I think that there were more complex reasons for that.
This movie has no tolerance for complexity, which is incredibly grating every second of it.
The childlike logic of this film comes from an honest place. It is directed by a man named Sean McNamara, who has directed a lot of children's entertainment, everything from episodes of That's So Raven and Even Stevens to the movie Soul Surfer and The Miracle Season, Cats and Dogs 3, Paws Unite, Bring It On, Fight to the Finish, Bratz, the movie. So I think it tracks that a man who has created a lot of television for children would make this movie, because it takes a very simple view of the way the world works.
Well, remember that word we came up with, Oscarbation? This movie has a number of terrible Oscarbatory performances where people are giving all this Oscar speech energy with this terrible script.
Like, they do really think they're making a really good and profound movie.
But everyone in this has been everyone. About 3/4 of the people in this movie have been in a good movie or a good TV show, often more than one. So surely they could judge the difference of energy, or they or their agent could judge the quality of the script. Which goes back to that quiz that we did in the preview episode where you observed that everyone in this was either desperate or canceled.
Truly, and it does make you appreciate, like, acting is a hard industry, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's hard out there. Like, one day you're up, one day you are in Reagan.
Yeah, so Reagan is out of office, and there's a scene that was genuinely touching that I read an interview with Reagan's daughter, Patty, where this is based on something that actually happened. He sees little model of the White House in a goldfish bowl, and he looks at it and he says, I know this has something to do with me, but I don't remember. That was genuinely sympathetic, and they show his slide into dementia. They show that they have him reading through his note to America about I have Alzheimer's. But then his Secret Service and Nancy agree to do an incredibly dumb thing, which they're worried he'll get thrown from his horse, but they agree to one last ride. The thing is, he has dementia. He's not going to remember next week that he already agreed to one last ride. So you're still risking the former president getting thrown from his horse for sentimental reasons. This is terrible elder care, and I should have put elder abuse in the trigger warnings.
I don't want to watch anybody suffer from dementia. It's awful. It's sad to see someone start to stumble that way. I would also like to give Dennis Quaid a little bit of credit. This was the point where you actually saw him doing some acting because you saw him being affected by the fact that he couldn't remember and that things were slipping. It is very sad to age and lose your memory and pass away. But it was really nice that he got to die in comfort, surrounded by loved ones and at an old age, and feeling safe and secure and receiving, really great healthcare. Unlike the men and women that he sentenced to a death in shame and fear with AIDS. So that must have been nice for him, right?
Sure, his family appreciated it.
Yeah. Yeah. And with the healthcare that he didn't want anyone else to have. Because as we recall, that monster Jimmy Carter was talking when they were telling us how bad he was about people in America deserving health care. It must have been really nice for him to die like that, even though it is very sad that he had dementia and Alzheimer's. And
yeah.
It was sad for Nancy. We saw Penelope Ann Miller cry for like 25 minutes. Should we, did you have any choice dialogue?
No, this script may be as bad as The Conqueror.
It's pretty bad.
It's not as bad as The Conqueror because it doesn't have that pigeon Shakespearean thing going on. There was no choice dialogue. Are we ready to score this fucker?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. Outward appearances, makeup and hair. I give this a 1. As I said, everyone looked horrible and beyond parody.
I also gave this a 1. It looked like they were wearing rubber masks of themselves. It didn't help the acting how little they were able to move their faces. It all looked so fake and so bad. For acting and casting, I gave it a 2, and I know this is being generous. I felt sorry for Mina Suvari. Voight actually was good in the old age scenes, minus the Russian. Everyone else was so wooden in this.
I also gave it a 2. Same reasons. And also Dan Lauria was, I thought, good in as much as anyone could be good in this.
Passage of Time, I gave it a 5. I knew exactly where and when we were, but I knew that because they bonked us on the head with it.
I gave it a 4. Broadly, I understood where we were and when we were most of the time, but there were some periods where I was like, we're in the 80s, like where it got a little vague and hard to discern. So yeah, down the middle. Costuming?
Gave it a 6. It was decent but uninspired.
Yeah, I gave it an 8. I thought the suits looked great, but also to your point, yes, uninspired. I didn't find fault with the costuming to the degree that I did literally everything else in this movie.
For quality of the script, I gave it a 1.
Yeah, I gave it a 2, and I don't know why I went that high. Accuracy, the events were all accurate in that they happened, but the positioning was insane in a lot of cases, so I gave it a 5.
I gave it a 3 in terms of and then this happened. They were following a storyline that was true, but they did something that makes this not even a biopic, which was to add people who aren't real to interact and be a framing device. So that was why I gave this a 3. I had to ding them hard for that.
That is completely fair. For storytelling, I gave it a 3.
I gave it a 2.
Production value, I gave it a 3. There were those nice overhead shots of the ranch. They used that drone real well. They did a good job, such as it is, merging real footage and fake footage, and merging real footage and the film. Mm-hmm. And also in importing like a very real looking Walter Mondale in the background rather than having like a rubber-faced monster playing Walter Mondale. That was done well in a way that was not distracting. The way that they merged having a real actor playing Jimmy Carter versus then showing him through the film lens so you're seeing the real Jimmy Carter.
I was a little more generous than you. I gave it a 6 for production value because the shots of the ranch were beautiful. There was the use of the footage. I thought the Oval Office looked real. For production direction decision making, I gave it a 1.
Same. This is barely a movie.
Yeah. So for Do We Care, I gave it a 0.
I gave it a 1. And the only reason it was that high was that until I figured out who Dana was, I was really invested in the journey of the speechwriters because I love a speechwriter. My score came out to a 3 point.
All right. So mine came to 2.7, but I'm using the buy. This was hard. 1.7.
I'm here for it and I respect that decision.
The average score comes to 2.35. So Reagan, ding, 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 ding. Congratulations. You have earned a second opinion.
So just to explain second opinions, this is an element that we stole blatantly from the podcast, How Did This Get Made? Where we have trolled the internet to see if we can find people who loved it.
Yes, and we do second opinion if a film scores below a 4 or above an 8. If it scores above an 8, we find bad reviews for good movies. Do you want to read this first review, Sarah?
Sure. First review written yesterday by Ivy Dana. Excellent movie. This movie is incredible. Well made, wonderful actors, and the story is inspiring. Can't say enough about it. Sad the media is suppressing it. They are too scared it will give people positive views of Republicans and Christians. And Lord knows the legacy media cannot have that. I encourage everyone to watch this regardless of what side of the aisle you are on. Dennis Quaid did an amazing job. This is something that you can take your children to as well. It is family-friendly and entertaining. If you want to learn more about Reagan and the movement he led, this is definitely a movie for you and your family to watch. 10 out of 10. A lot of exclamation points in there. Anyway, you want to read the next one?
This one, written yesterday by Redbird48, called A Great History Lesson and a Positive, Uplifting Movie. The movie was well written. The filming was excellent. The actors were well cast. Dennis Quaid really poured his heart and soul into portraying Ronald Reagan. There was a great deal of history covered regarding the world during Reagan's presidency in dialogue and in photos. It was a great history lesson for younger people who weren't alive when Reagan was president. For me, this movie was a positive, uplifting experience. The left-controlled media tried to destroy Reagan when he was president, and now they're doing it again with their reviews of this movie. Don't listen to their drivel. See the movie.
This is objectively not a good movie. It crammed 75 pounds of stuff into a 5-pound sack. Like, if only that. Like, there's too much stuff happening in this movie for it to be any, like, sort of, like insightful storytelling. I can't. This is such nonsense. Okay.
They don't seem to understand the role of telling versus showing. When they have all these things to cram in, they do those short scenes with 5 or 6 exchanges that are incredibly didactic. And then they have Jon Voight there just to tell you how to feel instead of doing a more subtle showing versus telling thing. They just couldn't bear that.
First, you mentioned the framing devices, the many of them. Like, one of them ends halfway through the movie in the assassination attempt. And the other one, like this Voight framing device is entirely unnecessary. It's hero worshipy enough. Their god king would, if he could, rise from the dead and pat them on the head for making this movie, even without the Jon Voight sequences in it. Okay, I've got one more.
Okay,
10 out of 10.
on me.
Incredible. Jordan Rose, 83626. So we've got to teach history based not on what's in fashion, but what's important. Why the Pilgrims came here, who Jimmy Doolittle was, and what those 30 seconds over Tokyo meant. 40 years ago on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, I read a letter from a young woman writing to her late father who'd fought on Omaha Beach. Her name was Lisa Zanetta Henn, and she said, "We will always remember, we will never forget what the boys of Normandy did. Well, let's keep her word. Well, let's help her keep her word. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit. Let's start with some basics, more attention to American history and a greater emphasis on civic ritual. And let me offer the number one lesson about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night, in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.
That said nothing about the movie. I'm confused.
It didn't say anything about the movie. And that's the whole review. I want to be clear. I didn't cut anything. That's the review.
All right. So I forget what that other thing we needed to talk about was.
Oh, the goldfish sequence.
Yes. So apparently, over the closing credits, they revealed what the little boy wrote in the response to Reagan's letter about the goldfish, but we missed this because we needed to run out of there. Normally, I like to defend Marvel movies. That closing credits sequence has gotten everybody used to sitting through the entirety of credits, which is how we missed the goldfish letter. So I blame Marvel for this because they just assume that people are going to sit through the credits.
Well, to be fair, this was kind of a superhero movie.
All right. Sarah, what should people watch instead of this? Trumbo.
Watch Trumbo? I have a whole list here. Varying in degrees of educational versus entertaining. So Trumbo, go back and watch Milk again. Watch or read And the Band Played On. Watch Atomic Blonde if you want to see some enjoyable, fun entertainment around the fall of the Berlin Wall. Also, the wonderful documentary How to Survive a Plague about the heroic efforts to try and stifle the AIDS epidemic. While we're on the topic of Dalton Trumbo, Spartacus. It's a good time.
Yes, Spartacus, which is going to be our New Year's movie.
So, this has been fun. If you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can also follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is @BiopicAPodcastStory. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in our show notes as well.
Tune in next week when we'll probably be discussing Gandhi, although that'll be in 2 weeks because, and starring Pancho Villa as himself, episode 19 is coming out the week after episode 20, Reagan. And we explained why. Have a fantastic week, everybody.
Don't see this movie.
Do not see this movie.